in a week, we're going to see how the man in our story fits with our verse. Does anybody, this is a trick question. Does anybody know the name of the man in our story?
God.
God is in our story, but that's not the man. He's not the man in our story. I'm going to see if Maddie fell for my trick. Who's James? Yep, you fell for the trick. It's not James. James tells us something that was true about this man. But I will say this, his name starts with a J. And his story is probably written in the oldest book of the Bible. You know how the Bible has books? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The oldest book of the Bible has this man's name and it starts with a J. And I think actually that Jayla knows somebody with this guy's name.
I think it might even be a brother.
Job. That's right. So our story is about Job. And the Bible tells us that Job was one of the greatest men of the East. And what that means is that he was very powerful. He was very rich. Let's see, these men are standing in the gate at Uz, and we can just imagine that they're standing there, and everybody in Uz, that's the name of the city, knows Job. Job is from the land of Uz, and these men are here. And if we were to walk up there and say, hey, so tell me something about Job, and one of the men would say, well, he is very, very, very rich. He has, and I'm going to get the animals messed up, 7,000, I'm going to have to cheat. I forgot. I read it and I was not thinking. He has 7,000, what does he have? Oh yes, 7,000 sheep. Now, we don't have sheep around much these days, but that meant that he was very rich. He had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. Now, camels, those could do a lot of work for you. And he had 1,000 oxen, and he has 500 donkeys. Now, that's a lot of animals. What would you need that many animals for? Well, because he was rich. He had lots of things. He needed those things to do. Can anybody add that up? How many animals did Job have? Yeah, I'll repeat the numbers. We weren't paying attention. You didn't know I was going to ask that. 7,000 plus 3,000 camels plus 1,000 oxen plus 500 donkeys. How many? How many is that? She's a little older, I think. How many? 11,500 animals. And you could say to this guy, you say, wow, he is really rich. I'll bet he is super proud and snobby. You know how rich people are, right? They don't want to be around other people. And the guy answered and said, oh no, Job is rich, but he is not snobby, and he is not proud. He is a good man. In fact, everybody likes to know and listen to what Job has to say, and all of a sudden they get quiet, because you know what happened? Whoops, not in that picture. Job happens to walk up, and you see him, and everybody starts going, they stop paying attention to you, and they start going to Job, because they got the question they want to ask Job, because Job is very wise. He's the type of man that everybody goes to and asks him questions. He's the type of man that people follow because he does the right thing all the time. And the people really think that Job is a very important person. So you're sitting there and you're listening, and as you listen to Job talk, you find out some other things about Job. Job had 10 children. Now that's a lot of children. He had 7 boys and 3 girls, and they were all good people themselves. They were good men and good ladies. They were all grown, and they had their own families, and the boys, the 7 of his sons, each son, when it came to be their birthday, they would have a big feast and have the rest of their family over, and they were kind and friendly with one another in their family. And Job, we would also find out that he was a praying man. Job prayed for his sons and for his daughters. Job was a really, really good man, at least from what we could tell. But does it matter what everyone in the world thinks of you? What matters? Is there anyone that matters more than all the people in the world, what he thinks of you? Jasmine? God. That's right. If I think that the mayor is a good person, that's nice. But what's more important than what I think? What God thinks of the mayor, right? If I think Maddie is a nice girl, that's nice. But what's more important? What God thinks of Maddie. What God thinks of Jasmine. Right? What God thinks of us. I mean, if Mrs. Voegtlin thinks I'm a nice guy, that's good. But what's more important? What God thinks of me, right? So what do we think God thinks of Job? The Bible tells us what God thinks of Job. One time, God said to someone, he said, have you considered my servant Job? He is blameless, he's upright, he fears me, and he turns away from evil. Those four things God said about Job, and I want us to think about those for a little bit. What do you think it means? See, God, this is what God thought of Job. God saw Job. God could look through the earth, and he saw Job, and he knew what kind of man Job was. All the people in Uz knew what kind of man Job was. He was kind to the poor and helpful and all of that. But God also knew what kind of man Job was. And God said that Job was blameless, that, put this in the right order, he was upright, that he fears God, and that he turns from evil. Now, what do you think it means to be blameless? Anybody think, what does it mean to be blameless? That, if we said that person is blameless, can you think of another word or a description of what blameless is? Jayla, you had your hand up. What do you think? What were you going to say before I kept talking? God said Job was blameless. Okay, what's she saying? Oh, you could accuse Job of something, but he didn't. You could say he did something, but he probably didn't do it because he's blameless. Yeah, that's right. In fact, if he's blameless, you really can't accuse him of anything because he doesn't do anything wrong. Now, of course, Job was a man and he sinned, but you couldn't say Job is a liar. You couldn't say Job is a thief. You couldn't say any of those things about Job because it wasn't in his character to always lie or always steal or always cheat or always be mean. You couldn't say Job is hateful. You couldn't accuse Job of anything. He sinned once in a while, but he didn't keep sinning because God said he was blameless. And then he said he was upright. Upright. Now that has, you see the word right in there? See that? Right? And there's another word that has right in it that's longer. Righteousness. Job was a righteous man. He was an upright man. He always wanted to follow what God told him to do. God told people. He made known to them what he wanted them to do. And so Job would make sure he did those things. If there were laws in his town, he probably obeyed those laws, didn't he? A bad person would disobey the laws. But Job, he was an upright man, and he would obey the laws of his town and the laws of God. And then the Bible, God said that Job feared him. Job fears God. He feared God. Now that doesn't necessarily necessarily mean that he was afraid of God, like God's a boogeyman. You know, you've probably seen a movie where there's monsters and everybody's scared of them. That's not what God is like. But Job was afraid of displeasing God. Job did not want to do anything that would displease God, not because he was afraid that God was going to beat him and hurt him, but because he knew who God was. And we should, and God can and will punish us for our sin, but we should want to fear God also. And then, finally, God said that Job turns from evil. If Job, somebody said to him, hey Job, let's try this. And Job thinks, that doesn't seem like a right thing. A right thing. And Job is upright, so he's not going to be around something that's wrong, right? And he fears God. He says, I don't want to do that because that will displease God. So what will he do? He turns from evil. See? So, Job is a good man, isn't he? Everybody around knows Job is rich and powerful, but he's not prideful, he's not mean. He's kind to the poor and to the widows, and he's helpful to people, and he gives advice that's good advice, and everybody wants to listen to him. And that's all good, but even more important than that is that God says that Job is blameless, he's upright, he fears God, and he turns from evil. Now, I started to say something, I might have kind of already said it, but what does this picture remind us of? Who's this? This represents Job, and what does this represent? God. And so this shows us that God could see what kind of man Job was, doesn't it? Right? Now, so, what does this picture tell us? What does this represent? God. Who do you think this represents? People. Are you a person? All of us are people, aren't we? And so if God could see what kind of man Job was, and God knew what kind of man Job was, what did God say Job was? He was blameless, upright, fears God, and turns from evil. What does God knows what every person in the world is like, doesn't he? He knew what Job was like, he knows what Jay was like. He knows what Miss Megan is like. He knows what Eliza is like, and Lamar, and Pastor Voegtlin. He knows whether we're blameless, whether we're upright, whether we fear him, whether we turn from evil. And so how can one of us, how can we be blameless? Where's my blameless? The last one. How can you and I be blameless? Every one of us sins, don't we? If we're a sinner, we're not blameless, are we? Okay. Is there some way that we can become blameless? There is. We can be blameless if we turn from our sin, we repent and turn from our sin and turn to Jesus. How can Jesus make us blameless? Jesus died on the cross and covered all of our sins with his blood. So if we turn to him, we can be blameless. And then, upright. How can we be upright? If we seek to obey God and do his will and obey his word, we can be upright. Right? If we are obedient. Are we obedient? Are you obedient? Sometimes you obey, probably, I hope. But sometimes we disobey, don't we? God knows that. God sees that. And then, can we fear God? Yes, we can. If we live and we think, oh, God doesn't like that. If God doesn't like that, we shouldn't like it. If God says something is evil, I don't want to do that. Because that would not please God. I want to please God. I'm afraid of not pleasing God. Right? So, doesn't matter what the world says. Doesn't matter if people say that God be pleased with that? No. Everybody that says that that's okay, God is not pleased with. They don't fear God. And God knows whether we turn from evil, doesn't he? Sometimes we're with our friends and they say, hey, let's go do this, right? And you know in your head, you know in your mind, I shouldn't do that. That's going to be bad. Do you turn from that and say, no, I'm not going to do that? Or do you go along with it? God sees all that, doesn't he? God can approve us. He can know that we're a good person by his standards, or if we're not. God knew what Job was like, and God approved of Job. He said to somebody, he said, you think you're doing whatever you want? Have you looked at my servant Job? He's blameless, and he's upright. And he fears me, and he turns from evil. And God knows all those things and everything else about us, too. Now, next week, I'm going to tell you who God said that to. God and this person had a conversation about Job. And next week we'll tell you who that person was that God was talking with. That person hated Job.